Welcome back, bienvenue and all that jazz. It's time to talk about some books. And as promised, we are here today to talk about the books that I read in the month of October in 2023. And so we're catching up. This is the last wrap up to catch up, and then I will be back on track for November wrap up in a couple weeks. So in the month of October, I managed to read 9 books, totaling 4,474 pages. And they were significantly shorter books or they were books that I just didn't have an audiobook for. So my audiobook time is down dramatically to only 28 hours listened. But at least from September, my average rating has gone up a bit. So in September, it was 3.75 stars, and in October, it was a flat 4 stars. So that's going in the right direction. We obviously want to love all the books that we read, but that is not a reality. When you read more than 100 books a year, you're going to have quite a few stinkers. So with the statistics out of the way, let's just go straight into the books that I read. And as always, we are going in ascending star order. But before we get into that, we have one book that was a kind of soft DNF. It was one of those ones that I was reading it. It was fine. I kind of put it down, never ended up picking it back up. I still intend to someday, but that is Rebirth by Christopher Russell. This is a self-pub sci-fi fantasy, I think leaning more towards the sci-fi. There are some fantastical elements, but it has very like modern warfare stuff with almost like helicopters and guns and like war scenes, and it just wasn't totally clicking for me. And so I just kind of put it down, and then unfortunately never went back to it. But I do intend to someday, and you should definitely check out the description if that book sounds good to you. We'll start with the actual books that I finished. And so my least favorite books of the month were 3.5 stars. So they were still good, but they weren't like amazing. And so the first one that I'll talk about was Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. This is book 2 in the original Red Rising trilogy. And I will say, unlike book 1, there was much less of a reliant on Darrow being this kind of white knighty figure where he's just saving people from the horrors of the world. And we do get some interesting movement in the kind of political landscape and kind of starting to see the bigger issue that we are going to be looking at in the Red Rising trilogy. However, I don't know what it is, but it feels like, especially in Golden Sun, I am reading like the spark notes of a larger story, because it just feels like we jump from big dramatic moment to big dramatic moment to big dramatic moment. We don't see any of his training in school settings. We don't see any of his nothing. We just are immediately going from thing to thing to thing to thing, which is okay, but it just made it feel so much less impactful because everything was at like 100 and it was all like telenovela melodramatic realness. But those moments hit less hard, at least for me, when they're always melodramatic moments. It never feels like there's a lull and then a surprise and then a lull. Like there was catharsis and then we get the next review. Like it was always just like thing after thing after thing after thing after thing. And it made me not love the book. It was fine. It was still like a fun enough time. It was definitely fast paced. You definitely can blow through these books. It's just like, because we don't see any of the like training or relationship development, like I don't buy into the dramatic moments as much. They don't hit as hard. I don't really care about any of the characters. We just don't spend any time with them. It's always just like emergency to emergency to emergency. And yeah, I don't know. Red Rising is definitely not my favorite thing ever. And then I also continued in another series. So then I read Valor, which is book 2 in the Faithful and the Fallen Quartet by Gwynne. And it is very consistent in quality, scope, style, storytelling as book 1 Malice, for good or ill. I still feel like it is quite slow. We are spending a lot of time like the opposite of Golden Sun, where the dramatic and like climactic moments are few and far between. It is like the literally diametric opposite. We are just kind of following these characters and kind of bopping around. It was a good enough classic fantasy time. I have now since finished book 3, so I'm trying to like separate what I remember from book 3 from book 2. I think in book 2 I'm still waiting to feel like this series is becoming its own, and I have definitely thoughts about book 3, but those will be in a later wrap up. Then we're moving on into my 4-star range, and so 4-star for me is like, it was quite good. I didn't have a ton of complaints. It just didn't like necessarily hook me, and is not like forever imprinted on my feels like a 5-star would be. I had quite a few 4 stars, and so I'll talk about the first 3 kind of all as one. I read the Cassidy Blake series by V.E.Schwab. This is her middle grade kind of spooky series, so that's City of Ghosts, Tunnel of Bones, and Bridge of Souls. And they are incredibly quick and short. And so I would recommend doing what I did, and I kind of just binge read all 3 back to back to back because it felt like a more cohesive story that way. We are following this young girl, Cassidy Blake, as her parents become these hosts of this kind of paranormal history type show, kind of like Scariest Places on Earth, if you remember that show from the early 2000s. And they are kind of going to these haunted places and talking about the history there. And Cassidy can see ghosts, and so she can kind of slip through the veil, and she gets kind of caught up in some shenanigans with this kind of paranormal society. And it's just really cute. Definitely hits the perfect like Halloween type vibes. And if you like middle grade and you like kind of spooky series, like maybe for next spooky season, then I would highly recommend you check out the Cassidy Blake series. Then the next 4-star read I'll talk about is the Fragile Threads of Power. So this is book 1 in the new continuation series of the Shades of Magic series. And I say it like that because this picks up, I don't know, like maybe 5 to 10 years after the events of the original trilogy, but we are still largely following the same core cast of characters. We have our Kel, our Delilah Bard, our Alucard, our Rye, like our main people. And then there's like a couple new characters that are added in, but it felt like it kind of relied on you having knowledge of this world and knowledge of the previous conflict and all of that kind of stuff in order for this book to kind of sell you. I also found the pacing quite challenging because I felt like the first half was this weird mix of like slow, but not in a way that I wanted it, because I felt like I wanted the resolution of what happened in book 3 in the original trilogy. And we kind of got that, but we got it in weird kind of short flashback sequences. So it wasn't enough of that. But then the stuff that we were doing in the modern times was a little boring. I don't know. And then by the end of the book, when we started getting into the more climactic moments, I quite enjoyed it, but there was one element in particular that really was a hard turn off for me for this book. And there was this introduction of a new character involved in a queer couple, shall we say, and I felt like it took something that felt like it was queer normative and forced it back into the heteronormative box, and I hated it. So but overall, the book is good. I definitely think that the marketing is lying to you when they say that you can jump straight into Fragile Threads of Power without ever having read the Shades of Magic trilogy. I think you're doing yourself a disservice and the story that is there in the Fragile Threads of Power a disservice. I think you definitely need to read the original trilogy before jumping into this, despite the author and the marketing trying to convince you otherwise. I think that you would have a hard time buying into character dynamics and a lot of things that they kind of just rely you already having buy-in from the original trilogy. Then up next, I read The Sun Prince by L.R. Schulz. This is book 2 in the Bonds of Kin, I want to say, series. If that's wrong, I'll fix it on the screen or whatever. But this is a debut self-pub fantasy series that feels kind of like Avatar: The Last Airbender vibes with how the magic works. Basically, there are certain people that can absorb sunlight and then they can do different things with that sunlight. They can shoot laser beams, they can like coat their weapons. It feels kind of firebendy to me. And this is book 2. So I can't say that much, except that it did have a little bit of middle book syndrome to me. It didn't really introduce new elements, but the way that book 1 ended and we went into book 2 felt like we were uncovering a lot of lore that was hinted at in book 1, which is fine. But it made the pacing a little bit weird. It made the stakes feel kind of funky to me, and I wasn't 100% sold on this sequel, but I do really like the world. I like the character dynamics. I like the animal companions. There are dragon companions, and in this book we get introduced to some crazy great eagle companions, and I do think it's a very, very fun series, but I do think that book 2 does suffer a little bit from middle book syndrome, so I'm kind of waiting to see what happens in book 3. Because we had a lot of new information. The political landscape is vastly different after the events of book 1 and now book 2. And so it seems like we have now established what our kind of big antagonistic force is going to be in this series. And so I'm curious to see what happens next. And I would highly recommend it if you like fast-paced, action-packed style stories. if you think the sun magic sounds cool, I do think it is definitely worth giving it a go for this series. So that is the last of my 4-star reads. We are now on to my 2 4.5-star reads. And I think the one that I'll talk about first is The Sunlit Man by Brandon Sanderson. This is Secret Project 4, the final Secret Project book. This one, unlike most of the other Secret Projects, where they were Cosmere related, but you could kind of pick them up and not have read much of the Cosmere, this one, you 100% could not do that. I don't know how this book would go if you had not read basically everything available in the Cosmere. It follows a character that you were introduced to in the Stormlight Archive. It kind of spoils some pretty major things in Stormlight Archive, some major world building information. And it also kind of relies on you having knowledge of investiture, unlike something like a Mistborn or even Warbreaker, where you have those moments where the characters kind of go over the magic system in some kind of training sequence-esque thing where you get a lot of information, sometimes too much, looking at you, Mistborn, of exactly how this magic works. Sunlit Man throws that all out the window. It just expects you to understand investiture. It expects that you know what Skage Reel is. It expects that you know a lot of information. And so if you are a huge Cosmere fan, I think it's a lot of fun for that, because you really get to start putting all of these different connections together and seeing kind of where the future of the Cosmere is headed, because we're kind of in the far future where space travel is a thing. And so we're seeing a lot of these magic systems that we knew in their more basic forms when they were locked onto their individual planets, but seeing how they've kind of progressed into the modern era is cool. And I think it is a very fun, fast-paced story. I don't think that the antagonist in this book is the best part. Like, I think this book, the best part of this book is really just all of that Cosmere stuff kind of coming to fruition and giving you a little tantalizing teaser of where it's going. I don't think that the actual conflict on this planet is the best part. It's the awesome world. The world is bonkers, crazy, and really interesting. And yeah, I mean, it was just a fun time, and what a journey these secret projects have been. It was kind of like a bookturnet phenomenon, and it's crazy that it's already over. And you can look forward to the Sunlit Man full spoiler-filled live show discussion. It is happening, or will already have happened by the time this video goes up, so I will link it if you want to go have more spoiler-filled thoughts on the Sunlit Man. But that takes us to the best book that I read, or my favorite book that I read in the month of October, and that was following up on September's book of the month. It was book 2 in the Queens of Renthia series, so that was The Reluctant Queen by Beth Durst. This series, just the world and the cool spirits and all of that, just, it is so cool, and it just kind of hits kind of some of those nostalgia feels of like Spirited Away, but it's not really Ghibli-esque. It's very much its own thing, and just where we went with the story after the events of book 1. We also get introduced to a new character in book 2, and in the beginning I found her kind of frustrating, but I do love meeting a older character. She's more like in her 30s and she has children, and that's part of what was frustrating, but also realistic, because she was willing to basically let the world fall apart because, well, what about my children? And just seeing her growth to where she ends up by the end was so good and made me so excited for where book 3 is going, and just seeing the evolution of a certain character from book 1 and where they're at now in book 2 and what that means for book 3. I'm so ready, and I see now why so many people have talked about this as kind of a hidden gem, because I really think that it is fantastic for what it is. Is it going to give you the most political, lore-rich story? No, but it is going to give you enough information to get hooked on this awesome world building with these really fun characters and this kind of bonkers plot that they are on. And yeah, so I mean, if you're somebody who wants like 700, 800 plus page chonkers, then this is not the series for you. But if you're somebody who's looking for much more like digestible, they're all like 400 pages or less, and it's just a trilogy that's completed. I think if you haven't tried it yet, you should definitely try the Queens of Renthia series, because it is quickly becoming a new favorite series of mine. But those are all of the books that I managed to get to in the month of October. Have you read any of these? Do you want to talk about any of these? As always, if you want to leave any kind of spoilers, just hit enter a bunch of times to leave some space and then we can chat. If you just want to leave an emoji to let me know you're here, maybe leave like the Queen emoji, since it's the Queens of Renthia still holding strong in first place. I hope you had a fantastic reading month in October. I didn't read quite as much as I had initially thought I would, but it was also the month of my Beth, so I obviously got sidetracked by my birthday on Halloween, and then just getting into the kind of the spooky season vibes of watching a bunch of horror movies, and it just sucked at my time. But I had a fantastic October, and I hope you did as well. But that does it for today's video, so please do all the things. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more bookish shenanigans like this from moi. Other than that, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye!